prisoner sat on his haunches in his earthen prison and clutched his head in both hands, clutching desperately to his greasy hair and praying to die. It was incredibly hot in his cell, but that was the least of his concerns. He had been here a long time, but had no idea how long because time had ceased to exist in the impenetrable darkness of the cell. It was impossible to keep track of time in a void. When he had first awoken face down in the sweltering darkness, his nostrils full of the scent of freshly dug earth, he had been like a panicked animal. He had shrieked himself raw in a feeble entreaty that was probably drowned out by the relentless pounding of the drums. He had walked the circumference of the cell hundreds of times, feeling the loose dirt walls, desperately trying to find a way up and out, but he quickly learned that the cell curved towards some small point above, like a soda bottle. There was no purchase to be had from the walls as well. The dirt was almost as smooth as glass and completely without feature, save for a tiny trough that water trickled down occasionally, which was collected in the floor in a small bowl. He had never been fed. The drums are what had awoken him on that first terrible day. He had been in a daze, unaware of where he was or why he was, and when he opened his eyes, he thought he had gone blind. Open or close made no difference. The blackness was absolute. Wave a hand in front of your eyes and see nothing. It was frightening, on the first day, to be in such darkness with the drums your only companions, and the fears that enveloped him that day were nothing compared to what was to come. The drums were constant, unrelenting, and as the hours wore on and his shouts for help went unanswered or ignored, they seemed to pummel their way through his weary eardrums and into his very thoughts. Here in the depths of darkness, the drums ruled all. The prisoner had no idea when he was awake or not. The passage of time had lost all meaning. Was he trapped in an endless void, or was it an eternal moment? The dreaming and waking world had become fuzzy around the edges and overlapped, so much so that even when he was awake he sensed things in the emptiness, impossible shapes only hinted at by his fevered imagination and outright terror. Sometimes in the periphery of his vision, he knew he saw flitting creatures made of even darker stuff than the rank air of this place. He saw them just beyond the veil of his sight, hiding in the periphery just beyond the borders of vision, if indeed his eyes were even open. They mocked him, laughed just below his ability to hear them, especially with the drums pounding. At first they were maddening in their malicious playfulness, but as time went on and sanity began to slip away like the memories of dreams on waking, he began to be actively afraid. It wasn't that these phantoms threatened him, but the whispers he seemed to catch were voices of such gleeful malice, promising agonies undreamt of by man. He started to curl into as small a ball as possible and just wait to die, only moving when thirst became too great to be denied, and he dared to move, and thus mark his place in this hell, dislike it. He had lost all sense of self, all grasp of who he was. He assumed he was a terrible man to have been condemned to this existence, but he couldn't remember anything. His mind had been stripped, layer by layer, to a rudimentary, animalistic state just to keep him alive. That base sanity was fraying, though, and before long he feared it would snap entirely. It would almost be a relief to yield from reality and just let go of his fear and hunger and pain, really. When he first came to this place, he had been aware of his hunger as just an absence of weight in his gut, a lack of contented fullness, but as time wore on, it became painful. As the time passed, though, it became an almost physical presence, a need that consumed so much of his thought that it was almost a joyful feeling. Hunger was bad, but it beat terror by a long way. Eventually, the hunger backed away, as if his brain told his stomach, we get it, you're hungry. There's nothing to do for it, so shut up. He was weakened as well. When he first arrived, he had tried crawling up the walls to no avail. He had the strength to pace and rage, question and cajole, threaten and pound his fists against the solid earthen walls. He had even tried tunneling, but the earth was so hard he did more damage to his fingers than the wall. He had given up fairly quickly, his bleeding fingers adding pain to his overall misery. After a long time, hope finally fled. He was trapped, and like any caged animal left unattended, he knew he was as good as dead. "I'm sorry, Amanda," he croaked, not even knowing who Amanda was, or why the name that had escaped his chapped lips sent a stab of pain through him that had nothing to do with his torments here. It didn't matter who she was, or what she meant to him anyway. Whoever that name represented was lost, gone from his mind as readily as his own name, fled from a reality too terrible to endure. He was done. He was dead. With that thought he gave in, and fell over onto the ground, a wasted, pathetic shell of man he had been. The heat in the drums swarmed to a frantic crescendo, and he wished to die, just to end it. The drums ceased as if on cue, and there was silence. That in itself was more terrifying, and for a few minutes it seemed as if he could still hear them beat as his rings rang in sympathy for their absence. He sat and waited for a time, waiting to taste whatever new torment was to come. It didn't take long. Light slammed into his eyes like a physical thing, unused to absorbing any as they had been for so long. He raised a withered arm against the assault and moaned. The light was brilliant, painful, and even though mere moments ago he could have sold his soul to be free of the darkness, this cure was worse than the disease. He could hear sounds, his poor ears still beating in sympathy with the now ceased drums. The light fluctuated, and then arms were upon him. Something was draped over his wasted head and beneath his arms. Then he was raised off the floor and lifted up and into that horrid light. So bright it was as useless to his eyes as the darkness had been. He tried to moan, to beg, but had the strength and wherewithal to do neither, and wondered feverishly if this was what it was like to be born. And that thought brought another stab of emotional pain for no reason he could grasp. He was thrown unceremoniously to the ground, and he heard feet move away from him. The prisoner awaited some coup de grace, some end to him, almost eagerly. He waited and still was met with silence. No hand grabbed his hair, no blade sank into his wasted flesh, nothing. He lay unmoving for so long he wondered if he was perhaps already dead. Then he gingerly opened his eyes. He was surrounded by things. Horrible things with men's bodies, but with fearsome heads of evil, twisted animals. Shaggy pelts and great antlers were displayed alongside feathered carapaces and scaly, gilled fish faces. Some females dotted the crowd, their upper bodies without clothes as well as their male counterparts, but the curves of hip and breast meant nothing to the prisoner or to their compatriots. Their nakedness felt more natural than arousing, a primal state of power and purity untouched by the juvenile aspects of sexuality. Even if he weren't in his wasted and mad state, the twisted animal faces they wore and the savage air they produced would have softened even the most ardent of suitors. All were mostly nude, all unmoving, all silhouetted by a roaring fire behind them. It was a visage of hell. Their stares were accusatory, the air itself thick with hatred and anger. What had he done? What sin had he committed to be hated by these creatures? He had no clue. Finally, one of them moved, a creature with a strong, lean male built in the face of some incredibly awful wolf, its jaws wide with a lolling tongue protruding from pointed teeth. Around his neck was a leather string, and on its bare chest a pouch hung. A long mane of pure white fur ran from the scalp and over its shoulders, so brilliant it was like staring at a star. Such a contrast of beauty against the hideous face was disturbing and visceral, like a madman's self-portrait. That was not the most awful part, though. The most unnerving thing about it were its eyes. Wide, very human eyes that reflected nothing but vast, endless emptiness from deep, sunken sockets. All sorrow, all pain, all without hope of redaction. It stepped forwards carrying a wooden plate. As it came to him, the prisoner assumed the plate would hold the weapon that would end his life. But as the monster kneeled before him and laid the plate on the ground, he looked down and was transfixed by what he saw. On the plate was a slab of meat. It was bloody and raw, freshly cut from some beast. It was repulsive, vile, yet his stomach seemed to expand at the sight of it. He looked at the meat, then at the monster, and tentatively reached for it. He did not want to eat it. He didn't want to touch anything the monster gave to him, but his belly ached and his hand trembled in the air as his revulsion warred over the need to survive. The thing before him made not a sound. It did not try to stop him, nor did it try to coerce him. It was a patient abomination. The prisoner felt a tear run from his left eye as his stomach won the war of attrition and he succumbed to the hunger. He grasped the meat in his filthy palms and brought it to his face, unmindful of anything other than the uncontrollable animal need to feed. He was gasping for air, and the silence that had held in his belly was replaced by a roar of greed. No longer in control, he opened his mouth and bit deep of the flesh. It was salty and bitter, and he ate it like it was the best steak ever to grace a barbecue. He swallowed the lump of flesh and was taking another bite when he felt a change in the air. Joy seemed to swoop through the assemblage like a flock of birds, yet no one made a sound. He sat there, his teeth buried in the unspeakable meat, and stared out at the creatures with the mad eyes of a rabid dog. They began to part, stepping away from the fire, becoming almost insubstantial and fading from view. From their depths came forth a creature with a gleaming black bird's head and the body of an old woman. It walked forward with a slow, painful gait, with no need to hurry. In its hands it held something, invisible from where he sat in the dirt. The prisoner didn't know what it was, but he tried to back away as the thing ambled forward, the meat still clenched in his teeth. His hand scraped against the lip of his cell, and he shrank away from it in terror. There was no way he could return to its inky darkness. As it grew closer, it became clear that the bird's face was as much grotesquerie as the wolf's. Its eyes were wide as well, but with a gleam of gleeful madness, as if it knew a secret it was dying to tell you and which it knew would drive you insane. The bird's bill came to what appeared to be a mad smirk. It stopped before the prisoner and brought out what it had been holding within its withered hands. It was a pouch made of what appeared to be leather fastened on a long string, and at a second glance seemed to be the twin of the one the wolf creature had worn. Ornate runes were painted on it, as well as primitive hieroglyphs that meant nothing to the prisoner. It was the size of a large lemon, and gave off a fragrant scent he could not place. The creature leaned in and seemed to breathe in the prisoner's terrified exhalations for a moment, relishing in his fear and madness, and then it looped the pouch over his head. He was so frozen it didn't even occur to him to move. The crowd of creatures let out a sigh, but the raven before him let out a cackle as unearthly and piercing as the scream of an eagle as it swooped to bring death to a terrified rabbit. The raven pointed a crooked finger at the prisoner and said a word. Wytiko. The prisoner had no idea what the word meant, but a ball of ice bloomed in the pit of his stomach, and his balls curled up against his torso despite the heat. Wytiko! Again, in a stronger voice. Then the raven stretched its arms out to its fullest. The feathered wrap draped around it, giving it the appearance of some great bird about to take flight, and let out the word in a long, undulating shriek. Wytiko! It then laughed its laugh, and the crowd of monsters joined in and began to dance around the fire, hooting and screaming as they went, chanting the word over and over as the drums began again. A pair of the creatures, apparently swept up in the moment, lay down and began coupling frantically as others watched and hooted their enthusiasm into the night. The prisoner crawled away for a few feet and then got up on legs that threatened to give out beneath him with every tentative step. The raven watched him but made no move to stop him. He broke and made his escape. He stumbled into the forest, expecting every step to be his last. He glanced back just once before the forest swallowed him, and saw the wolf beast kneeling before the raven in humble supplication. He was running as well as he could, ignoring the scratches that tree branches were tearing into his flailing arms and the fact that his feet were raw and bloody from trekking through the woods barefoot. Exhaustion and a seeming eternity without food made the run difficult on his legs that felt like pure jelly. He was naked and terrified and lost, but death out here in the forest was far better than enduring whatever the beasts he was fleeing from had in store for him. It was night, but the moon was so full he could actually see quite well, as shafts of light streamed through the canopy of trees overhead, lending a bare luminescence to the undergrowth. Also, a deep mist had started to cover the ground, and that reflected the light to an unearthly degree. It was almost like being in a bad snowstorm. Soon it was irritating his eyes, but he stumbled on, trying to get as far as possible away from the monsters he was fleeing. There was no destination in mind, just a need to escape what had happened and get somewhere safe. Where was safe, though? Did the concept even hold any meaning anymore, or would he flee for eternity? He kept hearing whispers, and that made him feel like he was being tracked, hunted, but every time he threw a terrified glance back, he could see nothing. Also, though the air had been warm when he had first entered the forest, he was now very cold, and his breath swelled out in front of him as he ambled through the forest. The mist that covered the forest floor was like ice, and clung to his shins as he trudged through it. It also was strangely heavy, and weighed his body down, and crept up his legs, its icy presence like tiny, deft tentacles of ice. He felt it on his arms as well. Suddenly he was actively frightened of this forest, even more so than of the menagerie he was running from, and he had the first inkling that he had been released on purpose into a false sanctuary which held even worse terrors. Don't think about it, his frantic mind whispered. Just move. He took a few more faltering steps as the mist clung to his wobbly legs, seemingly trying to bring him down. How could mist feel so tangible, so substantial? In his ears the whispers coaxed him to lie down, to rest, but he was too frightened to do so. He stumbled, regaining his precarious balance, and took 2 more agonized steps before finally stopping. He stood there, panting for a moment, and then tried to go on. His body went forwards, but not his traitorous feet. He probably tripped on a branch, but his overtaxed mind would swear the mist had tripped him. He put out his hands to brace for inevitable impact, knowing that his wasted arms would most likely shatter on contact with the ground, but the mist swirled around his arms. The sensation was like driving your fists into a pile of snow. He shivered, but was placed gently on the ground on his hands and knees, impossibly supported by the swirling mists as they lowered him. They then began to crawl up his entire body, tendrils of iciness that he was certain would hold him still if he resisted, yet which also caressed his flesh like an eager lover. The insanity of the moment slammed home, so much so that he voiced his feelings to the empty woods. Am I crazy? The fog gave no answer, but in the distance he saw something coming forward, some brilliant shade that sloped towards him with terrible intent. He dreaded its every step. It walked on 4 legs, and the mist parted before it, falling to the side and dancing gleefully, swaying almost in a dance of welcome, a dance of ecstasy. The creature walking towards him was a snow-white wolf, yet with every step he could see mist bleed from its edges. As it came closer and closer, and he could see more of its visage, the prisoner's terror grew. It was emaciated. Its ribcage showed through its ragged pelt and bony ribbons, and its eyes were sunk deep in its face. Its mouth was open, its lower jaw and tongue slack, so that each step that the creature took, it swung back and forth in an almost hypnotizing rhythm. From its slack jaws, heavy ropes of saliva that seemed to freeze into icicles dangled before breaking off its chin and falling to the mist. Its breath came in long, wheezy draughts, and each exhalation seemed to swell the ranks of the mist as it came ever closer. It made no sound, but an aura of cold came with it. By the time it stopped its advance, the prisoner was colder than he had ever been in his life, shivering uncontrollably with dread and frost. The whispers had escalated, though, and now he could swear that they were coming from the pouch around his neck. The beast took another step forward, and his face came within an inch of the prisoner's. It tilted its head and stared into his eyes, almost inquisitive. It was more than the prisoner could bear. He closed his eyes and begged for his death to be quick. Quick it was, but not the way he thought. The immediate sensation was like he had dunked his face into an icy river filled with spiked eels. Cold pierced his flesh and ran through his veins. He gasped and felt cold invade him. It ran down his throat and coated his lungs. It streamed through his nostrils, freezing snot and mucus. His eyes opened wide with shock and saw the beast's body losing its shape, becoming insubstantial white mist as it became less and less the wolf and flowed into him in a torrent. It was running into his mouth and nose, through his flesh, his eyes, an icy invasion of his very self. He tried desperately to close his mouth, tried to get his hands over his face to stem the invasion, but the mist clung to him so hard it was like being buried in concrete. He gagged, he coughed, and tears streamed from his eyes and froze to his face as he was violated. It ended. The mist released him, and he stood. For a moment, all was well. Better than well. He was strong again, and stood upright. He breathed cold air, and it sliced his lungs as he did so, but he was alive. Then, the hunger. It came on him like a tidal wave, a hunger that made the piddling emptiness he had experienced before feel like he had just eaten Thanksgiving dinner. This new hunger swept all thoughts of anything else from his mind. His belly swelled with emptiness to grotesque size, and he grasped it with his arms and moaned. Wisps of mist began seeping from his pores, and then poured from his every opening. He vomited it, cried it, shat it. Soon he was wrapped up in a writhing mass of flowing white. He felt his flesh melt away in an inferno of iciness, and soon he was begging for death, for release from this madness and agony as he saw his body transformed and reordered into a new lupine shape. His legs stretched in an agonizing snap as his lower legs bent back in an unnatural way and formed an alien second joint in them. His arms elongated, and his fingers grew into incredible talons meant only for slicing of flesh. His face, oh God, his face lengthening and puffing out, teeth sliding from within his jaws like cat's claws, each one a knife honed to razor keenness. New sight was coating his old, and new thoughts were overlaying his mind as the external transformations also seeped inwards, his sense of self drowning beneath a tsunami of raw animal urges he had no hope of withstanding. It was like being buried in a blizzard, and he sank beneath the weight of the cold that had enveloped his body, the hunger that had enveloped his senses, and the madness that was overtaking his mind, goaded on by the shouts of guttural language roaring from the pouch that still clung to the new form that stood in his place. When he looked down, he saw what he had become, and he simply stopped trying to fight the invasion, and he let go, drifting into madness. What stood where the prisoner had stood, what he had become, was an abomination. A 9-foot-tall, snow-white super-predator, the likes of which hadn't stalked this continent in an age untold. Shaggy, matted fur coated its body, yet here and there patches of it were bare, as if the creature were afflicted with mange. It had long arms that dragged on the ground as it walked upright on double-jointed legs. Behind it, a shaggy tail swung in lazy arcs. Its ears were large and pointed, and its eyes were huge and sunken, crazy from starvation. Its belly was distended to sickening levels, as if it had never eaten before. The mist swayed and danced and caressed the beast, raucous at this unholy baptism. The newly born creature raised its long snout to the fullest of moons and let out a long, low howl of loss and hunger that ended in a pathetic rasping note, almost a smoker's cough. It cocked its head as whispers filled the air from the pouch, and then it stalked into the night. As it went, the mist crawled along the ground as obedient as a faithful hound. On the forest floor, next to some finger marks clawed into the earth, was the only record that the prisoner had ever been there. In the moonlight, a band of gold lay twinkling, removed for the first time since it had been placed on the prisoner's finger on a day that had been the happiest of his life. It glinted in the moonlight, a mournful reminder of a life lost and forgotten.